My name's Ann Ray. I'm with the Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. For those of you who don't know us, we're at University of Florida. We were founded by the state legislature in 1988 to serve as the state's affordable housing research arm. Thank you. I'm going to express my appreciation to the Chamber for inviting us to speak about the report today, and particularly to JP Morgan Chase and to Ann Reinert from Chase, who really approached us as researchers. As Chase has said, and she in particular has this long-time commitment to affordable housing in Florida, to ask what are the impacts of the lack of affordable housing in Florida on children? How does it affect their health, their education, their development? And what we chose to focus on is the effects of homelessness and housing instability on children's education in Florida's public schools. So we got data from two sources. We collected data from the State Department of Education over a period of years, comparing homeless students with non-homeless students on a variety of educational indicators, behavioral, test scores, disciplinary indicators. And we also interviewed 29 liaisons throughout the state who are working for county school districts who are directly responsible for their district's homelessness programs. Every public school district in the country, every local district, has to appoint a particular point person to work on homelessness issues. So we talked to people in urban areas and rural areas and suburbs. So I'm going to talk about the findings from the report, and then I'm going to hand things over to our partners from Miami Homes for All, who develop policy recommendations to address the findings. But just to start with, here are the takeaways from the data. First, we found that over the past decade, the number of students identified as homeless in Florida schools has grown tremendously. Second, we found that most of these students are living in situations that we might not necessarily think of as homeless, but the educational system and under federal homelessness law and education law has a pretty expansive definition of homelessness. And in particular, there are many, many people, youth and families, who are doubled up with others because they can't find permanent stable housing. We found that this increase is taking place across the backdrop of a severe and increasing shortage of affordable housing, particularly for low-income families. We found that on every measure we looked at, homeless students lag significantly behind their housed peers. And we found that unaccompanied youth, those who are older, who are not living with a parent or legal guardian, face particular challenges. So I'm going to go back and go through those in a little more detail. I'm sorry, how do you advance this? There we go. Okay. So to get to the first point I talked about, the number of students in Florida who have been identified their schools as homeless has more than doubled in the past decade, from about 34,000 in the school year ending in 2008 to almost 73,000 in the school year ending in 2016. So a huge increase in a very short time. And part of the reason for that is a genuine increase in the number of children and youth in need. You saw earlier today the statistics on child poverty, and we're using the same source that showed that the percentage of school-age children in Florida living in poverty grew from 16% in 2007 to more than 1 in 5 in 2015. This is taking place against the backdrop of the foreclosure crisis, of the recession, and then even as the economy is coming out of recession and employment's picking back up, housing wasn't getting any cheaper, and rental housing had never really gotten any cheaper. And so a growing gap on the one hand, the number of poor children and families, on the other hand, the shortage of affordable housing. But there's another thing behind these numbers too in this increase, and that's a real concerted effort by the state and by school districts to identify kids who would qualify as homeless under this expansive definition that I talked about. And so students who might not think of themselves, or families who might not think of themselves as homeless, they're living doubled up with others, they're living in hotels and motels. The state was training school districts, and school districts were training teachers and counselors and the frontline workers that see students every day, school bus drivers and cafeteria workers, that families might be eligible for the assistance that homeless kids can get in school. And a lot of schools, in fact, rebranded their homelessness programs to talk about children or students or families in transition, to take away that stigma from people identifying themselves as homeless. So on the one hand, there's a real increase, but on the other hand, there's a real increase in students getting more help that they need. We have on our website, and I'd be happy to look at this afterwards with anybody who wants to try it out on their own phone or mobile device, a map of all the schools in Florida and identifying all the schools that had identified at least 10 or more homeless children. And so this is an example pulled from that map of the state as a whole, and we use the Tampa Bay area as an example. Every red dot is a school. Every blue dot is a school that identified at least 50 homeless children in the school year ending in 2016. And so there's a real swath of those schools, particularly in Central Florida, moving over to Tampa, in Southeast Florida, and then both in the Northeast and Northwest corners of the state. But when we do that query again, but we look for the schools that have at least 10 homeless students, it's almost all of them. So if people think this isn't happening in their backyard, both in those zip codes where you saw low poverty rates and particularly in the ones where you saw high poverty rates, they might be surprised. So this, I think Anna's found this to be an effective advocacy tool to bring the issue of student homelessness really home to the person you're talking to. You can layer on congressional districts or state legislative districts on this, and as I said, I'd be happy to help anybody either here or after you go home with using this tool. As I said earlier, about 3/4 of the homeless families and youth who are identified were doubled up with others. It's by far the most students in the state who are identified as homeless. Most of the others are pretty evenly divided between either living temporarily in hotels and motels or in emergency shelters and transitional housing facilities. Here in Central Florida, around Orange and Osceola County, that number in hotels and motels is more like 20%. So most students have some kind of roof over their head. In any year that we looked at, though, we're now close to 2,000 students who are living in places that are not designed for human accommodation at all. Cars, parks, a substandard trailer, an RV and a campground. And when I talked to rural homeless liaisons in rural districts, they particularly said, we have just a small church shelter, or if somebody can't find somebody to double up with, there's really no other resources for them, and we have people living outside. By the way, those numbers I showed you before were ending in the 2016 school year. In the last school year, the number of homeless students continued to increase by a few thousand, particularly in Miami-Dade and Jacksonville. The number of students identified here in the Orlando area actually went down that year, and that was before Hurricane Maria. Since the beginning of this school year, about 12,000 students have enrolled in Florida public schools who were living in Puerto Rico before, and about almost half of those are here in the Orlando area. Not all of them are identified as homeless, but again, it's continuing to put strain on the limited affordable housing that's available. In the report, we go into this in some depth when we asked the homelessness liaisons, why were families in their district homeless? One of the chief answers that came up was the lack of affordable rental housing. And so the report goes into some depth on the number of extremely low-income families in the state, those earning less than 30% of the area median income. It's about, depending on where you live, $18,000 to $20,000 a year for a family of 4. If they're going to pay just 30% of their income for housing, which is the typical standard, that's about $300, $400, $500 a month, including utilities. And these are families who need somewhat larger units. Our fair market rents in the state are more like over $1,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. And so we have a very limited supply of housing that's affordable at that level. Typically, it's either subsidized or it's market rate but severely substandard. And over the years, since the year 2000, we've added a lot of households who are extremely low income, but we've actually lost affordable housing units that are available to them. About 7,000 students that were identified in public schools as being homeless in the school year ending in 2016 were youth unaccompanied by a parent or a guardian. That's almost certainly an undercount. These students are older, they're sort of more sophisticated, less willing to be found, and they face this particular set of challenges and are vulnerable to sexual abuse, to physical abuse, disproportionately kids of color, disproportionately LGBT. And even in counties where I talked to liaisons where they said that they had a shelter or some place to send homeless families, they often said, I have nowhere to send unaccompanied youth. They may not be able to reunite with their families safely. They're not ready to negotiate the adult affordable housing system and the adult shelter system. So this is an area where we identified particular need. And fortunately, one of my co-presenters, Audrey, is really one of the statewide experts on this subject, and they're doing some really exciting things in Miami-Dade. So on the one hand, we found this very difficult thing that schools were dealing with. On the other hand, we're able to talk about what to do about it. I guess this really gets to the heart of the study and the data. We compared 3 groups of students using statewide data from the Florida Department of Education aggregated on individual students into 3 groups. Students who were identified as homeless, students who were housed but considered to be low income, and we based that on their qualifying for free or reduced price lunch, and students who were housed and we considered probably were not low income because they were on full price lunch. And on every measure we looked at, we saw a continuum of risk, where the homeless students had the poorest performance, the housed and low-income students were doing better, but they still lagged behind their housed peers who were not low income. First, we looked at were kids getting to school. And not surprisingly, the national literature really shows that a lot of the gap between homeless students and other students are because students are not getting to school, and you need to be in school to learn. What we found is that the average homeless kid in Florida schools missed 3 weeks of school in the year ending in 2016, about twice as much as the housed kids who are not low income, and the housed low-income kids were falling in the middle of that. And then chronic truancy, which the state defines as having at least 15 unexcused absences, so those 3 weeks within a 3-month period, that's a rare problem overall. There's only about 2 or 3% of kids statewide who are chronically truant, but 8% of homeless students were. So a small group, but ones that are really facing a very serious problem with attendance. We looked at FSA and SSA scores in that year ending in 2016 for grade-eligible students in English language arts, in math, and in science. So this is the percentage of grade-eligible kids who were taking and passing the tests. So the rest of the kids either weren't taking them all or more likely weren't passing them. And we found that only about a quarter of homeless students in the state were taking and passing these 3 tests, where the rates for, again, for housed and low-income kids, passing rates were higher, and quite a bit higher for housed kids who are not low-income. We've since looked at similar measures for the following school year, and we see a very similar pattern, including in the older grades when we started to get into some things that are necessary for high school graduation. So the algebra end-of-course exam, the biology end-of-course exam. And you see that same pattern repeating itself. And then that same pattern repeats itself with graduation rates, although actually the gap is not quite as wide. But we definitely see an achievement gap along that continuum of risk. And then finally, suspension. It's actually not a huge number of students statewide who are suspended, but the suspension rates for homeless students are much higher. About 1 in 6 homeless students was suspended at least one time during the school year ending in 2016, where for housed kids who were not low income, it was only about 6%. Given what we're learning now about how suspension can lead to bigger problems, how being out of school, of course, can lead to bigger problems, and we're starting to learn about even a school-to-prison pipeline, this high rate of suspensions is of serious concern. And finally, we asked the liaisons, based on their experience with kids, what would help them become permanently housed. And one thing to note is that those gaps that I just showed you would probably be a lot wider if it weren't for the efforts that the liaisons and the schools are making with students. The students who are identified as homeless are entitled to be enrolled in school immediately, even if they don't have all their documents together, to transportation back to their school of origin if the student and the parents and the school decide that's in the kids' best interest. So kids are traveling long distances, and school districts are spending a lot of money on buses, on gas cards, sometimes even on private vans, getting kids back and forth. Kids are getting special tutoring, they're getting after-school assistance, and then there's a lot of financial assistance that goes into this, meeting kids' basic needs, backpack, hygiene items, school supplies, and then some of the things that we need to make education a better experience, extracurricular activities, prom and grad bash tickets and caps and gowns. And so there's a small amount of public funding that's available for that, but all the liaisons said they really depend on private funding for those things. So if you're looking for something you can go out and do tomorrow, It's find the county homeless liaison in your school district and ask them what kind of financial support your business, your community group, your church can provide to them, because they absolutely depend on that. But of course, those are stopgaps, right? You're helping kids who are homeless. And so we asked, what do you think the kids need to become permanently housed? Their top response in rural districts, in urban districts, in suburban districts, everything in between, is our community does not have enough affordable housing. They also talked about the need for some kind of temporary and safe shelter so that families who are trying to save up for that, say, first month's, last month's rent security deposit were able to do so without spending all their money on a hotel room every night. They talked about the need for homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing services, not to get it so before people fall into homelessness, to be sure that they might have assistance with, rent arrearages or if they're behind on their utilities. So sometimes just a small amount of financial assistance can help stop somebody from getting into that cycle of eviction and then not having the entry costs to get into new housing. They definitely talked about the need for services for parents to become employed if they're not employed, and employed in better jobs, the same kinds of things that we've been talking about all day today. So job training, education, after-school care, transportation and childcare are absolutely critical for parents to be able to get to work. Again, especially the rural liaisons talked about the transportation issues. They talked about the need for case management and financial service skills training so that parents could become more financially stable. And they talked about the need for safe and developmentally appropriate housing and shelter options for unaccompanied youth. So I'm going to turn it, fortunately, these are things that we know how to do. And the liaisons in general, to the extent these resources existed, they were connected to them in their community. They just said there's not enough of them. And so I'm going to turn things over to our partners in this project, Miami Homes for All. Sabrina Velarde and Audrey Aradanis are going to talk about the policy recommendations and the program recommendations that come out of this.
My name is Sabrina Velarde. I'm the Housing Program Manager with Miami Homes for All.
And I'm Audrey Ardanis. I'm the Youth Program Manager there.
So Miami Homes for All is an advocacy organization, and our mission is to ensure that all Miami-Dade County residents have safe and stable housing. We do this through policy research, advocacy, and collaborative efforts. Today, we're going to be sharing some of the policy recommendations that emerged from our report, published in collaboration with UF's Schimberg Center for Housing Studies and made possible by JPMorgan Chase.
And we're also going to talk about some concrete examples that our organization has done in addressing youth homelessness in our community, and that way you can also implement those same systems in your community.
So, increasing the supply of housing that's affordable to extremely low income and very low income households is critical to ensuring housing stability and ending homelessness for students and families. As such, we must advocate to maintain and increase federal housing assistance, maximize the use of state and local housing funds, and preserve and maintain existing affordable housing, both naturally occurring and subsidized housing.
We must also create innovative and alternative housing options for unaccompanied youth. As Anne mentioned earlier, these are young people without a parent or legal guardian. We also have to think beyond housing. In Miami-Dade County Public Schools, this school year, they identified 8,000 students experiencing homelessness. In Miami-Dade, we have this collaborative effort. You all are probably more familiar with this now, the collective impact model. We have the HOME Collective, helping our Miami-Dade youth, and Miami Homes for All is the backbone support of HOME. So we bring together over 100 different agencies to address youth homelessness and how each of them can play a role in ending youth homelessness in our community.
So as we all know, federal housing assistance is in a constant rate of decline. The HUD budget proposal for fiscal year 2018-2019 is estimating that Florida will lose $460 million That amounts to a loss of several $1 million in very important programs that provide housing to ELI and VLI households throughout Florida. Most importantly, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is set to lose $171 million. What that looks like practically is 16,339 families in Florida will lose their federal voucher assistance. When we advocate at the federal level, we must advocate to maintain and increase federal housing assistance. Of course, that's the big picture, large-scale federal advocacy, which is kind of a drop in the bucket sometimes. So how do we alleviate that? How do we look at things on a more local, smaller scale? We maximize the use of state and local housing funds. In Florida, we have the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund, and I'm sure everybody has seen the articles about the routine sweeping of housing dollars out of the Sadowski Housing Fund into general revenue. Last year, for the 2017 budget, if I'm not mistaken, there were $291 million in the fund. $154 million were swept away into other areas, so not housing. We have to advocate for our state housing trust fund to be dedicated to housing as it was originally intended. These are, the Sadowski Fund gives money to very important programs like SHIP and SAIL, and the SHIP program dedicates about 25% to be used for security and utility deposit assistance, eviction prevention subsidies up to 6 months rent, and rent subsidies up to 1 year. Housing subsidies are incredibly important for households in the ELI and VLI range. It's very unlikely that housing or housing units will be created without a subsidy that cater to the ELI and VLI range. Additionally, there is no state requirement for set aside in the SHIP program that dictates what you have to do with the money. So you can very well, as a local government, shift those funds to be used for ELI and VLI households. Finally, or rather not finally, but second to last, I would encourage everybody to advocate for investing in loan funds and local housing trust funds. In Miami-Dade County, we have the Miami-Dade County Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and it's very unique in that it is both a trust fund and a revolving loan fund. So loan funds create a unique opportunity for generating renewable local sources of funding for affordable housing development. And the trust fund side creates a local subsidy option for housing that could not otherwise be built without the subsidy. So in Miami-Dade County, we had this great idea to combine the two, and that means that we can provide kind of like a whole financing package. But we can't maintain this trust fund with only government dollars or public dollars. It's crucial for local businesses and private entities to also invest in our loan fund so that we can create the housing that is so rare, so sorely needed in Miami-Dade County at least, and throughout Florida. And now my official finally, is to preserve existing affordable housing. So creative financing can be used to incentivize property owners of subsidized properties. In Florida, we are set to lose about 16,000 subsidized housing units in the next decade. These are units that are specifically affordable to incomes between 0 and 60% of the area median income. Incredibly important for students and families in particular. Creative financing can also help new owners acquire housing developments and maintain affordability restrictions, and can help to rehabilitate aging facilities, which are often suffering from deferred maintenance. And rehabilitation is sometimes 25 to 40% cheaper than constructing new units. The big point, the big picture is that collaboration across all sectors is important for addressing housing specifically. That's my silo, that's my field, but we at Miami Homes for All are very dedicated to breaking down all silos. So we collaborate with a number of entities across all sectors, the business sector, private, nonprofit, and public, to accomplish our goals. And I will now turn it over to Audrey.
Thank you. So again, we need to have innovative and alternative housing options for unaccompanied youth. Again, these are young people without a legal guardian or parent. We need to increase the number. Can y'all see me? Let me just put this down. Okay. Sorry. So we need to increase the number of youth-specific emergency shelter programs. All of us here might have an idea of what shelters are like. Imagine being a young 16-year-old and you're unaccompanied and you have to go to a shelter. It's not a friendly place. It's not a place that any young person would want to go to. So instead, a lot of times, like Anne was saying, a lot of them might sleep in parks, they might stay in friends' houses, on their couches. So we want to make sure that they're friendly. Chapman Partnership, which is one of the largest shelter providers in our community, they are now making a youth-friendly space for young men. So it's going to be a dorm-style setting. It's going to be friendly, and they're actually breaking down some barriers, because a lot of times, a lot of shelters have curfews. So now they're changing those curfews for young people. A lot of times when kids are in college, sometimes classes or when they're studying, they might stay out until 8, 9, 10 o'clock. How many of us remember those days, right? So these are times when it's critical for them to have the flexibility. And the program that they're also having is they're going to have an employment component to it. So they're going to be providing training and internships within the shelter and outside of the shelter as well. So they can partner up with other nonprofits and local businesses. We need to develop host homes, especially for rural parts. In Miami-Dade County, we have this area called Homestead, which is a rural community in Miami-Dade. A lot of times when young people are unaccompanied, unfortunately, there aren't that many shelters in those areas. So Miami-Dade County Public Schools received a grant from BB&T Bank, where they're actually providing stipends to families that are hosting unaccompanied youth. One of the examples of this, unfortunately, one of the youth that Miami-Dade has, he's one of the star basketball players, and his coach decided to host him. And, Miami-Dade was like, hey, what do you need? He's like, hey, this kid, he's a basketball player, he eats a lot. I need help. So Miami-Dade was like, hey, we got you. So they were able to provide him with stipends and gift cards to Publix, so that way he's able to have groceries. We need to adopt successful transitional housing programs for youth aging out of the foster care system. About 40% of youth experiencing homelessness are those exiting out of foster care. One of our partners is Casa Valentina, and they have a great transitional housing program where not only do they have housing for them, but they provide financial well-being courses. They partner up with local banks and other nonprofits to provide employment training, educational training, all of these different things. We also need to increase access of crisis shelters for minor youth. In our community, we have Miami Bridge Youth and Family Services, and they also partner with other local nonprofits and local businesses to give the youth field trips, show them career day, all of these different things, and provide outreach, including youth who are in the juvenile justice system. We really need to go beyond housing. When we're addressing young people who are experiencing homelessness, the target goal should not just be housing. For them to be prosperous and engaging citizens, we also need to address education and employment. We need to address their permanent connections, meaning mentorships or reuniting them with family. We need to address their health, their well-being. We also need to address their leadership development. Through HOME, our partners are able to accomplish some amazing things. So in our Education and Employment Committee, we have this great organization called Educate Tomorrow, and they partner with they partner with the local public higher education institutions and with other local businesses, and they have served 900 students to obtain their Florida State tuition waiver, so that way they can go to school and stay in school. We also have Pride Lines, which is an LGBT drop-in center in our community. And this year, they served 80 young people and partnering with other local nonprofits, reuniting them with family, providing family counseling, all of these different things. We also want to make sure we're addressing their well-being. So in our community, we have the University of Miami's mobile pediatric unit. Every single year, they serve up to 3,000 young people, making sure that they have their immunizations, they have primary checkups, they're being referred And they also have a counselor on board to provide some, some therapy sessions as well. That way, kids can go to school or obtain their job. And we also have a Youth Voice Advisory Council. HOMI has a board of youth with lived experience of homelessness, and they are the ones that lead HOMI. So initially, we were called the Youth Homelessness Initiative. How many of us think that's a really friendly name? Not really, right? So they actually led the effort to rename it to HOMI, helping our Miami-Dade youth. They picked out the branding company, they picked out the logo, everything. And now we actually have them sitting on local government boards and committees, and they are the ones leading those committees and saying, hey, let's make sure that your policies and your procedures are youth-friendly. Finally, a call to action. These are some examples that you can do in your community. So number one, recruit and retain workforce. Partner, with educational institutions. How many of you are already partnering with some schools or technical schools? Everyone should have their hands up, right? So in our community, Brayman Honda works with the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, adult education, and technical colleges, and they're recruiting young people in their mechanic program, and they're retaining them in their program by giving them that apprenticeship, and they're hired thereafter. So it's pretty awesome what they've been doing. The technical schools in our community has almost 100% employment rate. We also think that we should be providing financial well-being courses. So some of the nonprofits in our community, they partner with local banks to provide youth-friendly options for young people, and they provide youth-friendly workshops for them. A lot of times, I'm sure, how many of you at 18 knew exactly what to do when you had a bank account? Right. So a lot of times young people, they have no idea what to do, right? Sometimes they get, a lot of the youth that we have, they have stipends and they just end up blowing it away. Whereas they meet with local nonprofits and banks and they have the one-on-one financial well-being courses, and they're teaching them how to save money and how to invest. We also want to make sure that we're increasing and improving educational outcomes by being plugged into different networks. So how many of you are already part of some sort of collective impact? Cool, awesome, it's great. So I encourage all of you to join something like HOMI in your community. And if there isn't one, go ahead and find some partners that would be willing to start that with you. So in our community, we have the Children's Trust, and they are an active member, and they're one of the founders of HOMI, and they're an active member of our of the HOMI Collective, and they sit in on some committees and they learn as what can they do as a funder? What can they do to fill in some gaps in their community, in our community, and what they can learn from the other nonprofits.